The spire falls first. For a moment, it just tilts, almost gently, silhouetted against a sky glowing orange from the flames beneath it. And then it's gone, swallowed into the burning roof in a single collapse that draws a gasp from the crowd gathered along the Seine. It's the evening of April 15th, 2019, and Notre-Dame de Paris, a building that has stood at the heart of this city for the better part of 8 centuries, is on fire. People are crying openly on the riverbank, strangers holding each other, and somewhere in that crowd, a woman is singing a hymn, quietly, as if her voice could somehow hold the building together. Somewhere across the city, people are pulling over their cars and stepping out onto sidewalks just to stare at the smoke rising above the rooftops, unable to quite process what they're seeing. Firefighters will spend the night forming a human chain to save what they can. The relics, the paintings, a crown of thorns believed to have touched the head of Christ, running it hand to hand out through smoke-filled side doors, while structural engineers shout warnings about which sections of vaulted ceiling might collapse next, while officials debate whether the entire cathedral can even be saved. It survives, barely, and the fact that it survives at all says something essential about this city, because if there's one sentence that captures the entire history of Paris, it's the one written on the shield of its own coat of arms, Fluctuat nec mergitur. She is rocked by the waves, but she does not sink. To understand why that motto fits so well, you have to go back roughly 2,000 years, long before there was a Notre-Dame, a Louvre, or an Eiffel Tower, to a small island sitting in the middle of a river, inhabited by a Gallic tribe called the Parisii. They were fishermen and traders, minting their own gold coins, using the island's natural defences, water on every side, to control river traffic long before anyone from Rome had bothered to notice them. That changed in the middle of the 1st century BC, when Julius Caesar's legions swept through Gaul and eventually absorbed the Parisii settlement into the Roman world, renaming it Lutetia and expanding it onto the surrounding hills on the river's left bank. The Romans built what Romans always built: a forum, bathhouses, an amphitheatre capable of holding thousands, streets laid out in a disciplined grid that still, faintly, shapes a few of the older parts of the city today. For a few centuries, Lutetia was a modest, comfortable provincial town, nothing like the political and cultural capital it would eventually become. But the island at its centre never stopped being the place people instinctively returned to, especially when things got dangerous. Picture a Gallo-Roman merchant we'll call Marcus, running a small pottery workshop near the Forum on the left bank, selling everyday tableware to soldiers and local families alike, his kiln fired daily with wood hauled in from the surrounding forests. He'd have spoken a rough blend of Latin and the older Gaulish tongue his grandparents used, worshipped Roman gods layered awkwardly on top of older local ones, and thought of himself most days as simply a resident of the empire rather than anything more specific. That casual blended identity, part Roman, part something older and more local, is a pattern this city would keep repeating for the next 2,000 years, absorbing wave after wave of newcomers without ever quite losing the stubborn, independent character of the island where it began. And things did get dangerous. As Roman authority in Gaul crumbled through the 4th and 5th centuries, waves of Germanic peoples pushed into the region, and the town's residents retreated back onto that same small island their Gallic ancestors had first settled, walling themselves in behind the same natural moat that had protected the Parisii centuries earlier. The city that would eventually take its name from that original tribe, Paris, was born partly out of this instinct. When the world outside gets chaotic, come back to the island in the river. It's a pattern that would repeat itself, in one form or another, for the next 1,500 years. Picture a woman we'll call Aveline, living on that island sometime in the 9th century, in a small timber house crowded against dozens of others, inside walls that could barely contain the growing population. She'd have kept a mental map of the safest upper floors in her neighbourhood, the way people today keep a mental map of the nearest exit in an unfamiliar building, an instinct passed down without anyone ever needing to formally teach it. Her greatest fear wasn't invasion most days, it was the river itself. The Seine floods with a regularity that has shaped the personality of this city as much as any king or revolution, rising every so often to swallow the lower streets, ruin stored grain, and occasionally sweep away entire bridges built across it. Aveline would have grown up understanding, the way people understand weather, that her home might one day be underwater, and that she'd rebuild anyway, because everyone around her always had. That relationship with the river, equal parts dependence and dread, gratitude and grievance, would still be recognizable to a Parisian watching floodwaters rise along the same banks 11 centuries later. Aveline's island in this period also sat at the edge of a kingdom still finding its footing. Viking raiders sailed up the Seine more than once during the 9th century, and in 885 a massive Norse fleet laid siege to the island city for nearly a year, testing walls that had been hastily reinforced after earlier scares. The defenders held, barely, through a combination of stubbornness, a few genuinely clever fortifications on the bridges controlling river access, and the eventual arrival of a relief force. And the survival of that siege did more than protect a single winter's harvest. It cemented the island's reputation as a place worth defending at almost any cost, a reputation that would justify every wall, every rebuilding, and every stubborn refusal to abandon the site for the next 1,000 years. By the 12th century, the island city had grown well beyond its original walls, spilling onto both riverbanks, and its residents decided to build something that would announce permanently that this was no longer a modest provincial town, but one of the great cities of Christendom. Construction began on Notre-Dame de Paris in 1163, funded partly by taxes, partly by wealthy donors seeking favour with the church, and partly by the ordinary weekly offerings of parishioners who gave a few coins toward a building most of them fully expected to outlive their own grandchildren. And it would take nearly 200 years to finish, generations of stonemasons, carpenters and glassworkers who would never live to see the completed building, spending their entire working lives on a single project, because they believed, with total sincerity, that they were building something for God rather than for themselves. The engineering alone was audacious for its time. Architects needed a way to support enormously tall stone walls filled with glass rather than solid masonry. And their solution, the flying buttress, an external stone rib arching outward from the upper walls down to a supporting pier, let the cathedral rise higher and let in more light than almost anything built before it. Stand underneath it today and the technical achievement is easy to take for granted because it's simply beautiful. It's worth remembering that it was also, for its era, a genuine engineering breakthrough, achieved with rope, timber scaffolding, and remarkably little else. Picture a stonemason we'll call Bertrand, spending 40 years of his working life on that single building, starting as a boy carrying stone for older craftsmen, and eventually carving some of the smaller decorative figures around a side portal himself, never once seeing the western towers reach their full height before age and failing eyesight ended his career. He wouldn't have called it wasted time. In a world governed by the near certainty of an afterlife and the near certainty that this particular building would still be standing long after every person who worked on it was dead, spending decades on a project you'd never see finished wasn't a tragedy, it was the entire point. Cathedrals like Notre-Dame were built deliberately on a timescale longer than any single human life, as a kind of physical argument that some things, faith chief among them, mattered more than any individual's need to witness the ending. The city growing up around that cathedral in the medieval period was crowded, filthy, and intellectually alive in roughly equal measure. Narrow streets ran with waste that nobody had yet figured out how to properly dispose of, and outbreaks of plague, most devastatingly the Black Death in the mid-14th century, could kill a significant fraction of the population within a single terrible season. At the same time, the University of Paris, formally recognized in the early 13th century and centered on the left bank neighborhood that still carries the nickname the Latin Quarter after the language its students argued in, was becoming one of the intellectual engines of Europe, drawing scholars from England, Germany, and Italy to debate theology and philosophy in packed lecture halls. Disease and brilliance, filth and faith crammed into the same narrow streets. That contradiction, more than any single building, might be the truest description of medieval Paris. Students at that university lived in a strange kind of legal limbo that would feel bizarre today. They answered to church courts rather than royal ones, a privilege that occasionally let genuinely violent young men escape serious punishment for brawls and worse. And the neighbourhood around the university developed a reputation for rowdy, hard-drinking, occasionally dangerous student life that has, honestly, never entirely gone away in any university town anywhere. Lectures were conducted entirely in Latin, which is where the neighbourhood's enduring nickname comes from, and students travelled from as far as Scotland, Bohemia, and the Italian peninsula to study theology, law, and medicine, under masters whose reputations crossed borders more easily than most goods or armies of the period ever could. When the Black Death arrived in 1348, carried up trade routes from the Mediterranean, it killed an estimated third of the city's population within a matter of months, filling churchyards faster than gravediggers could keep pace. And yet, the university itself never fully closed, teaching on through waves of plague that would return in smaller but still deadly outbreaks for the next 3 centuries. By the late 18th century, Paris had become the capital of the most populous kingdom in Europe, and also, increasingly, a city where ordinary people were going hungry, while the court at Versailles, a few miles outside the city, lived in a style of luxury most Parisians could barely imagine. Bread prices climbed, harvests failed, and resentment against a monarchy that seemed increasingly disconnected from the suffering of its own capital reached a breaking point on the 14th of July, 1789, when a crowd stormed the Bastille, a royal fortress and prison that had become, more than anything else, a hated symbol of arbitrary royal power. Some of the crowd that day were seasoned soldiers who had deserted their posts. Others were tradesmen and shopkeepers who had never held a weapon in their lives. And the fighting that broke out at the fortress gates killed nearly 100 of the attackers before the garrison's commander finally surrendered. The Bastille held only 7 prisoners at the time, which tends to surprise people expecting a scene of mass liberation, but the symbolism mattered infinitely more than the body count. A crowd of Parisians had proven that the king's authority could be physically challenged and broken. And once that idea existed, it couldn't be put back in its box. The years immediately following were chaotic in ways that don't fit neatly into the clean narrative of liberty triumphing over tyranny that gets told in shorter versions of this story. Bread remained scarce, factions within the revolutionary government turned on each other almost as readily as they turned on the old monarchy, and pamphlets accusing yesterday's allies of being secret royalist spies circulated through the same cafes that had, months earlier, been full of nothing but shared toasts to liberty. And in October of that same year, a crowd of Parisian women, furious over bread shortages, marched the roughly 12 miles to Versailles and forced the royal family to return to Paris under something close to house arrest. A detail that tends to surprise people who assume the revolution was driven primarily by men. Ordinary women, market vendors and labourers played a genuinely decisive role at some of the revolution's most consequential turning points, armed with little more than kitchen knives, farm tools and sheer numbers. What followed was faster and stranger than most people expect. Within 2 years, the royal family attempted to flee the country entirely, disguised and travelling by night, hoping to reach loyalist forces near the eastern border and return with an army to crush the revolution. It's worth correcting a detail that trips up even careful storytellers here. The king wasn't captured at Versailles, and by that point, he wasn't even living there. He and his family made it most of the way to the border before being recognised and stopped in the small town of Varennes, identified, according to the most persistent account, when someone spotted his face and matched it to the portrait on the nation's currency. The journey back to Paris took days, the royal carriage crawling past silent, hostile crowds who had turned out along every mile of road just to stare. And by the time it reached the capital, the last shred of the fiction that this king still ruled by some sacred, untouchable right had quietly evaporated. He was brought back to Paris under guard, and the flight to Varennes destroyed whatever remaining trust existed between the monarchy and the people it claimed to rule. Louis XVI was tried, convicted, and executed by guillotine on the Place de la Révolution, now called the Place de la Concorde, in January 1793. What came next is the part of the story that later generations, including the French themselves, have never fully agreed how to feel about. The Reign of Terror, roughly a year of political violence beginning in 1793, saw the revolutionary government execute tens of thousands of people across France, many in Paris itself, on charges that ranged from genuine treason to little more than suspicion and rumour. Picture a man we'll call Etienne, a printer who'd genuinely supported the early revolution's promises of liberty and equality, watching from a shuttered window as tumbrils rolled past his shop toward the guillotine, day after day, carrying former aristocrats, yes, but increasingly also priests, moderates, and eventually many of the very revolutionaries who had helped start the whole thing, consumed by a purge that had stopped distinguishing between enemies and allies. It's tempting, looking back, to sort this period cleanly into villains and heroes, but the honest picture is messier. A genuine popular uprising against real injustice that curdled within a few years into a machine of suspicion and slaughter that eventually executed even the men who built the guillotine's legal framework. Revolutions, this one included, rarely end where the people who start them intended. The engine of that terror was itself an object of grim fascination, a beheading machine designed, ironically, by a physician who genuinely believed he was proposing a more humane form of execution than the axes and swords it replaced, quick and consistent, regardless of the executioner's skill or the condemned person's composure. Crowds gathered daily to watch it work, and the sheer routine of the spectacle, vendors selling refreshments, regulars claiming favourite viewing spots, is one of the details modern audiences find hardest to reconcile with their image of the revolution as a noble cause. Maximilien Robespierre, the lawyer turned revolutionary leader most associated with orchestrating the terror's worst excesses, was himself arrested and guillotined in July 1794, in a sudden reversal that ended the bloodiest phase of the revolution almost as abruptly as it had begun. Proof that, in a system built entirely on suspicion, eventually no one, however powerful, was safe from it. Out of that chaos rose a young artillery officer from Corsica, who would, within a decade, crown himself Emperor of the French inside Notre-Dame itself, taking the crown from the Pope's hands and placing it on his own head, in a gesture that scandalized half of Europe and thrilled the other half. Crowned in December 1804, inside a cathedral that had, only a decade earlier, been stripped of its religious function entirely and briefly used as a warehouse for storing wine during the Revolution's aggressively secular phase, a detail that captures just how quickly this city could swing between reverence and desecration for the exact same building. Napoleon Bonaparte turned Paris into the administrative and cultural centre of an empire that briefly controlled most of continental Europe, commissioning grand monuments like the Arc de Triomphe to celebrate military victories that, in the end, could not outlast his own ambition. His final defeat at Waterloo in 1815 ended the empire. But it didn't end Paris's habit of using architecture to announce its own importance to the world, a habit about to reach an entirely new scale. Napoleon's ambitions extended well beyond monuments. He reorganized the country's legal system into a single, unified code that still forms the backbone of French law today, standardized weights and measures, and centralized an education system that, for better and worse, made Paris the undisputed administrative brain of the entire nation in a way it had never quite been before. He also, it's worth saying plainly, reinstated slavery in France's Caribbean colonies after revolutionary governments had briefly abolished it, a decision that cost tens of thousands of lives in the resulting conflicts, and sits uncomfortably alongside his reputation as a moderating, unifying figure. Historical figures capable of reshaping an entire legal and administrative system in a decade rarely turn out to be simple heroes, and Napoleon is a particularly stark example of exactly how complicated that legacy can get. That next transformation arrived in the middle of the 19th century, under a man named Georges-Eugène Haussmann, appointed by Napoleon's nephew, Napoleon III, to modernize a city still built largely along its cramped medieval street pattern. Haussmann's renovation of Paris, carried out over roughly 2 decades, starting in 1853, was one of the most ambitious urban planning projects in European history, and also one of the most destructive. Entire medieval neighbourhoods, the narrow, crowded, plague-prone streets that had defined Paris for centuries, were demolished wholesale to make way for the broad, tree-lined boulevards that now define the city's postcard image. The stated goals were public health and beauty. Wider streets meant better sewage, more light, less disease. But there was a harder political calculation buried in the blueprints too. Wide, straight boulevards were much more difficult for revolutionary crowds to barricade than the tangled medieval alleys that had made earlier uprisings so effective. Progress and control, arriving in the same construction project, is a pattern that shows up again and again in the history of great cities. And Paris got a particularly dramatic version of it. The human cost of that renovation rarely makes it into descriptions of Haussmann's elegant boulevards. Tens of thousands of working-class families were displaced from central neighbourhoods they'd lived in for generations, pushed toward the growing outer districts as rents in the newly fashionable centre climbed beyond what most of them could afford. A pattern of displacement that European and American cities would repeat in various forms for the next century and a half. Picture a laundress we'll call Marguerite, watching the building she'd been born in reduced to rubble within a single week to make way for a boulevard that would eventually be named after an emperor she'd never once benefited from, relocating with her family to a cheaper, newly built district on the city's eastern edge, further from the markets and workshops that had employed her mother and grandmother before her. Paris gained its iconic skyline in this period. A great many of its poorest residents lost the only home they'd ever known to build it, and both of those things are true at once. The Belle Époque that followed, roughly the last 3 decades of the 19th century into the first years of the 20th, gave Paris the image most of the world still carries around in its head: cafe culture, impressionist painters setting up easels along the newly wide boulevards, and the construction in 1889 of an enormous iron tower built for the World's Fair by an engineer named Gustave Eiffel. A structure so widely disliked by the city's own artistic establishment at the time that a group of prominent writers and painters publicly petitioned to have it torn down, calling it a useless and monstrous eyesore. It was meant to be dismantled after 20 years. It's still there, obviously, having quietly become the exact symbol of French elegance its original critics insisted it could never be, which might be the most Parisian outcome imaginable, something loudly rejected by the tastemakers of its own moment, embraced anyway by everyone else, and eventually claimed as the essence of the city's identity. Those same decades filled the city's new boulevards and cafes with painters who were, at the time, considered a kind of joke by the official art establishment. A group that included Monet, Renoir and Degas held their own independent exhibition in 1874 after the state-sponsored Salon rejected their work as unfinished-looking and undisciplined. And a critic reviewing that independent show meant to mock one of Monet's paintings, titled Impression Sunrise, by calling the whole group Impressionists. The insult stuck in the best possible way, and the movement it named would go on to become one of the most beloved and commercially valuable in the entire history of art, painted largely by people the Parisian establishment of their own moment considered failures. It's a story that echoes the Eiffel Tower's own reception almost exactly, official taste rejecting something new, only for history to reverse the verdict completely within a single generation. Meanwhile, the city's grand department stores, its opera house with its gilded ceiling and underground lake that would later inspire an entirely different kind of legend, and its dazzling nighttime gaslighting, earned Paris a nickname that has outlasted every regime that ever governed it: the City of Light. Meant originally to describe both its literal illumination and its status as a beacon of education and ideas. That confidence was tested again, more brutally than almost any point before it, in June 1940, when German forces occupied Paris after France's rapid military collapse. For 4 years, the city lived under Nazi occupation, its famous boulevards patrolled by German soldiers, swastika banners hanging from public buildings, its Jewish population subjected to increasingly brutal persecution that would culminate in mass deportations to concentration camps, a chapter of the city's history that deserves to be named plainly rather than softened. Picture a young woman we'll call Colette, working a normal job by day and, in the evenings, quietly passing messages between members of the resistance, never entirely certain which of her neighbours could be trusted and which might report her for a reward or out of simple fear. Colette's evenings carried real weight. The French resistance in Paris relied heavily on ordinary people exactly like her, delivering coded messages hidden in bread baskets, memorising routes rather than writing anything down, and living with the constant, exhausting awareness that a single wrong word to the wrong neighbour could end in arrest, torture, or deportation. The Gestapo's headquarters on the Rue des Saussets became infamous for exactly that kind of interrogation, and thousands of French Jews, including children, were rounded up in a single coordinated raid in July 1942, held for days in a covered cycling stadium called the Vélodrome d'Hiver under brutal conditions before being deported east, the vast majority of them never returning. It's one of the darkest chapters in the city's history, and one that French authorities were, for decades afterward, reluctant to fully acknowledge as a matter of French complicity rather than purely German occupation. A reckoning that didn't arrive in full official form until a presidential apology in 1995, more than 50 years after the fact. Paris was liberated in August 1944, and one of the enduring stories from that week concerns the German military governor, Dietrich von Choltitz, who had been ordered by Hitler to destroy the city's bridges and monuments rather than surrender it intact. He disobeyed that order, whether out of genuine conscience, practical calculation about the war's inevitable outcome, or some mixture of both, is still debated by historians. And the city that emerged from 4 years of occupation emerged, remarkably, physically whole. Whole, but not the first time the city had faced this exact question, whether to burn or be saved. Across the Channel, London had confronted its own version of this reckoning nearly 3 centuries earlier, when the Great Fire of 1666 tore through the medieval heart of that city and forced a generation of architects to decide what kind of capital would rise from the ashes. Paris never burned quite that completely in a single catastrophic event, but the same underlying question, whether to preserve a chaotic, organic old city or clear space for something planned and modern, would define Haussmann's Boulevards, just as it defined Christopher Wren's rebuilt London churches. 2 capitals a few hundred miles apart, solving strikingly similar problems in strikingly different ways, one through fire and one through the deliberate swing of a demolition hammer. The post-war decades brought their own transformations, student protests and general strikes in May 1968 that briefly paralysed the entire country and permanently altered French attitudes toward authority. Waves of immigration from former French colonies that reshaped the city's neighbourhoods and its culture, and a steady modernisation that gave Paris the glass pyramid at the Louvre, the elevated walkways of the Pompidou Centre, and a public transit system that remains one of the most extensive on Earth. Through all of it, Notre-Dame sat at the centre of the city the way it always had, the literal point from which all distances in France are still officially measured. A marker embedded in the pavement out front that reads Point Zero, the place every road in the country technically begins. May 1968 deserves a bit more than a passing mention because it briefly looked, for a few genuinely tense weeks, like it might become a second French Revolution. It started with student protests at university campuses over education policy and social conservatism, spread with startling speed into a general strike that eventually involved something like 10 million workers nationwide, roughly 2/3 of the entire French workforce at the time. And for several days, government officials genuinely feared the state itself might collapse. President Charles de Gaulle, the wartime resistance leader turned post-war statesman, briefly left the country to confirm the military's loyalty before returning to call snap elections that, somewhat surprisingly, his own party won decisively. The uprising didn't topple the government, but it permanently shifted French culture toward greater openness around gender roles, sexuality, and authority in the workplace and classroom. Proof that a revolution doesn't have to succeed on its own explicit terms to still change everything it touched. Which brings us back to that April evening in 2019, watching the spire collapse into the flames on live television, while the entire world, not just France, seemed to hold its breath. The fire was likely caused by an electrical fault or a discarded restoration work. The official investigations were never able to determine the exact cause with total certainty. And for a few genuinely terrifying hours, French officials publicly doubted whether the whole structure could be saved at all. It was, in the end, saved through a combination of exhausted firefighters, sheer luck in how the wind was blowing that night, and stone walls nearly 900 years old that simply refused to fully give way. President Emmanuel Macron promised the cathedral would be rebuilt within 5 years, a timeline many experts publicly doubted. And yet, Notre-Dame reopened its doors to the public in December 2024. Its stone scrubbed clean, its spire rebuilt to its original 19th century design, having survived a catastrophe that briefly looked capable of erasing 8 centuries of history in a single night. The reconstruction itself became its own small drama, argued over in French newspapers with the same passion once reserved for the Eiffel Tower's ugliness or Haussmann's Boulevards. Architects and politicians publicly clashed over whether to rebuild the spire exactly as it had stood, a 19th century addition by the restorer Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, rather than a truly medieval original, or to replace it with something boldly contemporary, glass, steel, even a rooftop garden, that would announce the cathedral had entered a new century. In the end, tradition won decisively, and roughly 1,000 oak trees from forests across France were felled to rebuild the wooden roof structure, using techniques and hand tools deliberately chosen to match, as closely as modern craftsmen could manage, the methods of the medieval carpenters who built the original nearly 800 years earlier. It was, in its own way, one more instance of a pattern already centuries old in this city. Something is lost, an argument breaks out over what should replace it, and Paris ultimately chooses, more often than not, to rebuild itself in the image of what it already was. There's a version of this story that ends with simple triumph, the plucky cathedral that refused to die, and that version isn't wrong exactly, but it undersells what actually makes Paris remarkable, which isn't any single act of survival, but the sheer repetition of the pattern. A tribe on an island, choosing to defend a river crossing rather than abandon it. A city retreating behind its walls when Rome collapsed, rather than dissolving into the countryside. A cathedral built over 2 centuries by masons who would never see it finished. A monarchy destroyed, a revolution that devoured its own children, an empire that rose and fell within a single decade of ambition, a medieval city demolished so a modern one could take its place. 4 years of occupation survived by ordinary people making impossible daily choices about courage and safety. And now, a fire that took a spire but couldn't take the city built around it. None of that resilience was ever guaranteed. It was chosen over and over again by people who had every reasonable excuse to give up on the place and simply didn't. Walk along the Seine today, past the same bends in the river where Aveline once watched floodwaters rise, past the island where the Parisii first decided this particular stretch of water was worth defending, and you'll find tourists photographing a cathedral that, as recently as 5 years ago, was still under scaffolding and tarps, still uncertain whether it would ever look whole again. The bells rang again for the first time in December 2024, the same bells, largely, that had rung through revolutions, occupations, and 2,000 years of a city that keeps almost drowning and keeps somehow refusing to. Fluctuat nec mergitur was adopted as the city's official motto in the 19th century, inspired by the Boatmen's Guild, whose emblem, a ship on rough water, had represented Parisian trade and civic identity since the Middle Ages. It was never meant as an empty slogan. It was a description, written by people who had watched their own river nearly ruin them more times than anyone bothered to count, of the only strategy that had ever actually worked. However hard the water hits, you do not let the ship go under, and afterward you build the next version, stronger than the last.